Good day, everybody. This is Dr. Winkler again. This is the World War I class. This is lecture 25. We're going along quite well, and now we've gotten finally relatively late into the war to the point where we can start discussing the entry of the United States and U.S. involvement in the war. I can see it in your eyes. Actually, I can't see you at all, but I can see it in your eyes. You have a great interest in the United States participation in the war. What was the United States doing? Remember, I was talking about Woodrow Wilson. He is the President of the United States during the First World War. He's elected in 1912. He takes office in 1913. He serves 2 terms, which will take him up until 1921. The last couple years of his presidency, however, he suffered a severe brain aneurysm and was largely incapacitated. In any event, we need to look at his presidency. The war starts out in 1914, as you all know. And remember, the official line from Woodrow Wilson is strict neutrality. Even though the Lusitania had a lot of people very upset. People like Teddy Roosevelt saying, we've got to go to war. The United States courage demands it. Wilson says, no, I'm too proud to fight. And he kept on admonishing strict neutrality. In other words, you should be neutral both in action and in thought. He runs for re-election in 1916. It is a close fought, shall we say, close fought, perhaps not the right terminology. It was a election that was close. So Wilson barely won re-election. I wouldn't call this a roaring mandate from the American people, though a victory is a victory no matter how you want to look at it. Now, one of the slogans, which we do think that helped him get his re-election, was, he kept us out of war. As I mentioned last time, there's an irony here. He kept us out of war. He is inaugurated in March for a second term in March 1917. And at that point, just a few weeks later, he goes to Congress and say, we have to declare war on Germany. And on April 6th, Congress agrees and the United States declares war on Germany. Well, it's very helpful if you have your basic goal in mind, right? And I did mention this last time. One of the things that Wilson makes a big deal about this war is to make the world safe for democracy. And as I point out, in fighting with the largest single imperial powers in the world, actually, if we look at France and Britain, that clearly fits the case. Another U.S. ally early in the war, of course, is Russia. Well, we don't think of Russia so much as an imperial power as far as sending out navies and conquering areas in Africa. Russia has been expanding for a lengthy period of time into Central Asia. People who are not ethnic Russians, people who aren't even Christians. And they're dominating numerous minorities, the Finns, the Estonians, the Latvians, Lithuanians, the Kazakhstanis. Can we also say, therefore, that Russia is also, though they keep their imperialism closer to home, closer to the borders, they're not exactly a nation that likes to free peoples. And remember, Russia, though you can say a Duma does exist, it's hard to say that Russia is in fact a democracy. Can you see all the problems with this level of argumentation? It's more propaganda, in other words, it's information. To have a particular outcome or to influence public opinion rather than being accurate information. Okay, make the world safe for democracy. No, I'm sorry, we're not really fighting for that. The war to end war. Now, remember, he's not the first person to say this. The war to end war. Now, wouldn't that be nice? We fight this war and we'll never have to do this again. Well, wouldn't that be nice? However, can you assure that? In going out and killing tens of thousands of men, when you're through with that, you're going to make an equitable peace, the one that everybody will want to abide by? You see, also there's some problems with this as well, because as we get to the peace negotiations, we also know this Peace of Paris, and the one treaty that is directed at Germany is the Treaty of Versailles, also in 1919. Wilson comes down very hard on the level of punishing Germany. Well, if you want to keep the world from having another war, maybe you better have a peace that is going to be in the best interests of everybody to uphold and not leave a revengeful, defeated enemy. Well, the United States has enormous potential. I mentioned this earlier. Our enormous productive capability. The United States has the biggest GNP of any nation in the world. And quite frankly, the United States hasn't really met its industrial potential, even by 1917. Of course, our manpower is quite large. Population of the United States, what, 120 million, 130 million, something like that, which is larger than both Britain and France combined, considerably larger than that of Germany. See, the potential the United States has of creating a large army is there, and also supplying it properly. Well, what's the function of the U.S. Army? Yeah, we have wars. The Revolution, War of 1812, invading Mexico, the Civil War. Civil War is the big one before the First World War. At the remainder of the other times, what's the function of the U.S. military? We get along largely well with Canada. So we're not really having a large military to defend our northern border. On the southern border, Mexico, and we'll talk about this in just 1 minute, Mexico actually is a potential problem, but the power of the Mexican army is not nearly sufficient enough to really threaten the United States. Yeah, we have to garrison, shall we say, the border, but beyond that, why do you have a U.S. military? Actually, the function of the U.S. military, virtually from even well before the inception of our nation, going well up in the 19th century, was to protect Americans from Indians. Another way to look at that is to persecute and push back the Indians. To do that, you don't need a large military force. So in eras of war, 1812, War with Mexico, Civil War, to a small extent the war with Spain, not a big deal, because Spain can't possibly match the United States within a matter of months. Spain is literally trashed. You see what I'm saying here? The United States does not have a large military tradition. If we compare the U.S. military tradition with the major belligerents in Europe, we're Mickey Mouse. We're very small. There's no need for the United States to have a huge army. And by the way, in 1890, at the Battle of Wounded Knee, also known as the Massacre of Wounded Knee, where the 7th Cavalry gunned down over 250 Indians. At that point, what happens to the Indian threat? In other words, the United States military has largely lost its reason for existing. This is very important to realize this, because as our enemy ends up being Germany, as you all know, in the First World War, even our allies in the First World War have a tendency to look down upon the U.S. military capabilities. I mean, we can talk about the Civil War and the brilliance involved and the battles and the sieges, all these kinds of things, showing, in my estimation anyway, a great deal of military competence. On the other hand, the Europeans look at this, well, it's just a bunch of stupid amateurs on both sides fighting each other. So one of the reasons why the Europeans tend to downplay the lessons of the Civil War, including trench warfare and the use of rifles that can fire at distance, even though the U.S. musket during the Civil War is very, very slow and very crude compared to the Mauser rifles, which virtually everybody's using by the beginning of the First World War. Since the Americans don't know what they're doing, we shall not take lessons from them. If the United States has a small military tradition, almost none. We do have a few militias. What are militias functioning for? Actually, in reality, the militias initially existed very early on to fight Indians. Well, the Indians threat is really gone. The militia, we now call the National Guard, it exists in paper, but in reality, it's more paper than it is force. The United States, therefore, militarily is not to be feared, or at least they're to be, by our allies, to be coddled and brought along and taught because we're a bunch of ignoramuses. Can I say historically, looking back at World War I, World War II, do not downplay the military ability of Americans. There's something about Americans, culture, ideology, I don't know what it is, but you can take people from civilians and you can more rapidly turn them into competent soldiers, probably in the United States than anywhere else in the world. Remember, I mentioned earlier in earlier context, the Germans think you have to have your company, has to be in existence for like over 2 years for you to have any real high level of competence. And we're going to find Americans that were civilians and with a number of months have the military expertise to do a pretty good job. Now, this is true of the First World War. It's true of the Second World War, very much to the detriment of our enemies, because Americans show themselves to be really quite good at this. Okay, United States Garrison Force. Until the Mexican expedition. Well, what? Okay, there's a problem down in Mexico. Very unfortunately for the Mexicans. There's a civil war going on. And one of the rebels or famous men by the name of Pancho Villa. Do you have Pancho up here? Pancho Villa is a revolutionary. Well, there's civil war going down there. The United States is concerned because there's violence down with our neighbor on the south. And however, the United States has a tendency to view Pancho as a rebel, and the legitimate government being that of the Carranza. So the United States sends support to Carranza. Of course, Pancho doesn't like this. Pancho doesn't like this at all. So he starts attacking Americans living in Mexico. And even more shocking, he attacks, crosses the border into New Mexico and attacks the town of Columbus, New Mexico. Well, see if I can put it on a map for you easily. Yeah, okay. Even, I've never been there, actually. I understand it's a pretty sleepy town. It was a garrison force because the U.S. military was actually watching the border. And Pancho wanted to teach the Americans a lesson. He crossed the border. Actually, Pancho got the worst of this. Pancho actually lost a lot of men. In other words, in attacking Columbus, he got hurt worse than the Americans did. But what's the United States going to do? Just allows this bandit to come across the border. Incidentally, my grandmother, I should say, my mother's mother, was living in Mexico. She's born and raised in Mexico. And during the revolution, she managed to get out of Mexico, coming across the U.S. border. She died a long time ago, but I certainly knew her. And she talked about, on her birthday, which happened to be August 1st, 1916, where she came across the border, and they got into Texas, and one of my favorite stories is they were only allowed to carry one bag to get out. So this is August heat in Texas, and she wore two dresses, a dress on top of each other, so she would have the opportunity to. I've got that wrong. She came across before 1916. She was 16 in 1912. But this is before the U.S. incursion. But she's escaping a civil war in Mexico. Well, anyway, that's my family history. So I'm 1/4 Mexican. In any event, the U.S. President Woodrow Wilson decides that we can't let this go unanswered. So we take the Mexican expedition into Mexico to try to track down Pancho Villa. It's important for several reasons, one of which is the man who commands the Mexican expedition is John Joseph Pershing, who's later going to be chosen to lead the American Expeditionary Forces into France in 1917 and 1918. So I have a little bit more practice, a little more expertise. The United States does have men on horseback, but largely they come in on trucks and automobiles. So now we have, shall we say, a little bit more motorized deployment, which is also going to be important in helping us deploy in France. Get a few men, a few more officers, some more military expertise. It's a sham. Pancho, he knows the area, the Mexicans don't. There are skirmishes largely between American horsemen and a few Mexican bandits, but there's no way that Pancho is going to allow himself to have a face-to-face confrontation with an American army. We say more than actually doing damage to Pancho. Woodrow Wilson has made a statement, we ain't going to take it. And in doing so, he's acting tough, but catching Pancho doesn't work out. But Americans do have some practice now. I know I'm repeating myself. Oh, I'm good at that. Every time I think I've said something very important, I've already said it. Anyway, remember very early on I was talking about the British got a hold of the code books that the German Navy was using. And remember, I already mentioned this, the first act of war really by the British was to cut the German cables, so therefore they had to broadcast everything by radio out in the open. So Germans must send messages by wireless radio and they can be intercepted. I already talked about this. So I don't think I need to repeat myself. It's very important, however, to remind us of this because this is going to lead to an interception of the Zimmerman telegram. Let's get down here. Okay. Capture code books, yes. Naval code books. Read German codes, naval codes. However, the British are very good at this, at breaking codes. You get some linguistic geniuses, the kind of people, you know how it is, the kind of people that they teach themselves Greek when they're in junior high school because they got nothing else to do with their brain power. Brainiacs, probably very intelligent people, much like most of you. You sit around, play chess. I know the rules, but I ain't got the brain power. Something else blows me away. People do crossword puzzles. I don't know why I torture myself. Every so often I'll pull up a crossword puzzle in the newspaper and give a whack at it, virtually going nowhere. But the people who are good at these kind of things, who are good at mathematics, who are good at logic, who are good at words, are the kinds of people that can also be good at breaking codes. There are some similarities, they're not identical. There are some similarities between the German naval codes and the German diplomatic codes. And I'm not going to say that you can sit down and read a German diplomatic message sent in code You can sit down and read it, like you read a newspaper. You can't do that. But they have enough. So if you can get enough words here and there, you can place them together. Sometimes you have to guess the word you cannot decipher. But in effect, Britain is reading the German diplomatic codes. Now, the man who's over German foreign affairs is Arthur Zimmermann, a man who should never have this position because, quite frankly, he's over foreign affairs. This man really does some really stupid things. Well, Germany's desperate by 1917. One thing we really do need to remember is the turnip winter. Remember, that's very important in understanding Germany's will to keep fighting. It's also helps us understand a great deal the revolution in Russia starting in March 1917. But as Germany is very hungry, and some people are actually starving in Germany, Zimmermann starts thinking in desperation levels. How long can we keep on? How long can we keep this up? So he decides he's going to look for an ally. Well, the ally is potentially Mexico. Now remember, Mexico's got this problem down there. They got Pancho Villa, and they can we really say, in any real sense, can Mexico threaten the United States? The simple answer is no. They really cannot do this. But Zimmermann telegraphs the German embassy in Mexico City to give the Mexicans an offer if they will come in against the United States in the event of a war. Now, they offer them some pretty nice things. You want Texas back? Sure. Really? In a peace negotiation, we'll make sure that the Americans give you back Texas. And how about New Mexico and Arizona? Now, there's going to be some potential problems with this. Obviously, Texas is a rich place. In New Mexico, Arizona, not as much so. There are people of Mexican ancestry going back generations that live somewhat in New Mexico and also Texas. But still, the vast majority of people in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona are Anglos. They're Americans. They speak English. So you can bring those people into your country. Of course, that's going to change your map quite a bit. But can you really effectively rule these people? You see, there's real reasons to believe that this is a stupid idea. But from the German standpoint, this is a desperation measure. In the event of war with the United States, at least if the Mexicans come in, the United States is going to have to be concerned, at least until they push Mexico aside. They're going to have to be concerned about what's happening on their southern border. More so than sending an army to fight the Germans. It's intercepted by the British on January 16th and 17th. It's just a diplomatic code, apparently, initially. So the British aren't putting this in a high priority to decode this rapidly. However, you got to look at virtually all the message. They get these people that read the codes going down here and go, there's something pretty interesting in here. It does take days to decode it, but let's take a good, careful look at this one. So they look at it and go, holy mackerel, we've got a bombshell. Remember, what we want to do is get the Americans involved. If you can possibly do that, propaganda, Lusitania, all these kind of things. Let's get the Americans involved, which can very, very much help the Allied cause. Now, there's a pitfall of this. What if you release this? This is an authentic message coming out of Germany. You see, what will the Germans think? Well, we're reading the codes. You see, if they're reading the codes, and the Germans decide we've got to change all our codes to a code which the British cannot read, you see, you lose an enormous amount of potential Very, very helpful information. But this is such a bombshell. The British are willing to state that it's worth the risk because we think we can egg the Americans into coming in. So they publish the letter. Now, of course, people are going to look at this. Is this authentic or is this British propaganda? Some American eggheads take a look at this and say, this is pretty likely a forgery because there are terms here like California, names of states that really don't show up in diplomatic codes. The only way you could possibly understand this is that the British actually had the entire code book of the Germans, and no one believes that they do. So all Zimmerman has to do is stand up and say, this is a lie, this is British propaganda, this is something they made up to make us look bad and to bring the Americans in. There would have been a lot of people who would have bought that. Now, here's Zimmerman. He was foolish for sending the message in the first place. In second place, this is his real big mistake. He says the message is authentic. Okay, and his argument was this: Germany has the right to look for alliances anywhere it wants to. Well, yeah, but how's that going to play among the Americans? You see, this is crass stupidity. The pitfall, the potential pitfall, where the Germans will realize the British are reading their codes, that doesn't happen either. Because Zimmerman and his people are saying, there must be a leak somewhere. They never find the leak, it doesn't exist. So Germany gets egg on its face. Now, the United States doesn't go to war over this, but quite frankly, the United States is even more upset. What really has a tendency to bring in, what really brings us in is unrestricted submarine warfare. Once again, remember, this is 1917. Germany's in a world of hurts. They're really trying to get through a very challenging time. They've got to figure out a way of winning this war. Now, remember, they were attacking neutral vessels before 1915 with Lusitania. And then, of course, the United States is really upset. Like, darn, you Germans got to do something differently. So the Germans back off. Now, they're still sinking an awful lot of tonnage. But what if you have unrestricted? In other words, they will attack any ship, neutral nations included, including the United States, happens to be in the waters approaching Britain. Now, of course, you can do damage this way, but there's actually two ways the Germans are thinking. Yeah, we start doing damage, we can seriously hurt shipping coming in, so they think. Now, they have about 100 submarines. As we look back on this, though they do pretty severe damage, they really never have a submarine force capable of strangling Britain. But we can sink a lot of shipping this way. But something else the Germans think they can do is they can intimidate people from trading. If you can intimidate people from trading, they won't send ships to Britain at all. So it strangles Britain in two ways: sinking ships and intimidation. Did the Germans think the Americans would come in? Well, probably. They think the Americans will come in or might come in. Is it worth the gamble? Now, let's go back to the United States. Our enemies tend not to fear us enough. The old idea that Americans are just a paper tiger is not something that's just invented during the Cold War. The term isn't actually used until the Cold War. But quite frankly, the idea that Americans really can't fight, even if they can. How long is it going to take this little bitty American army, what, 100,000 guys? This little bitty American army to train, to get many men, and to supply these men, and to transport them to the battlefield in Europe? Even if that happens, maybe the decision can be made, at least on the battlefront, before the Americans arrive. Can we say it's worth a gamble? Of course, Wilson's upset, Congress is upset, and then the Germans start sinking American vessels. Civilian loss of life, ships go down. Nothing as spectacular as the Lusitania. But the American president and Congress and a lot of American people believe very strongly that Germany is making war on the United States right now. And in doing so, we have every right. We have every right to defend ourselves and declare war on them. So the Zimmerman, a lot of other irritations. One thing I want to point out here, which wasn't really largely known at that time, but the U.S. officials got a clue of this, was that there kept on being explosions in U.S. munitions factories. Now, that can happen all the time. There can be accidents. I mean, you're dealing with very volatile materials. However, the Americans are usually pretty careful, but accidents will happen nonetheless. However, it's been demonstrated that German agents were actually operating in the United States and trying to sabotage the U.S. ability to supply France and Britain. And a lot of these explosions were actually sabotage. So there's issues going on here. Obviously, sending agents into foreign countries is not unusual, but sending saboteurs in to blow things up, that's another act of war. So there's a number of issues that are really potentially damaging to the Germans. Well, the United States comes in, as I've already mentioned several times, April 6, 1917. The United States has a large amount of economic clout in the Western Hemisphere. The United States has a lot of political clout in the Western Hemisphere. And so several, was it 5 Latin American countries came in? Now, they don't do an awful lot. Can we say they're making a statement because their ships are being sunk as well? They're making a statement to Germany that, at least we have enough backbone to declare war on you. Except for the case of Portugal. No, I know Portugal is not in Latin America, but Portugal does declare war as well because the Germans have been sinking Portuguese vessels. And the Portuguese actually do deploy some men on the Western Front. Can we say this is not enough to make a big deal of difference? Let's just speculate a little bit. Was Germany an actual threat to the United States? We can say our vital interests. We should be able to ply the seas of the world and do anything we want, trade with anybody we want to. Of course, the British have made sure for a long time, since the beginning of the war, the United States will not trade and cannot trade with Germany. Well, we kind of overlooked that, remember? Was Germany a threat to the United States? It's a threat to U.S. shipping. Part of this is pride. Do you want to be a nation that can be pushed around? That if you sink a number of U.S. vessels and kill a few hundred Americans, does that necessitate the deployment of millions of men and the loss of tens of thousands of U.S. lives to prove that point? Did we overreact? I don't know. What was the appropriate response? We could have sent the U.S. Navy. Of course, we're going to start a very big naval program starting in 1917 to build up our Navy. As I mentioned earlier, by the end of the war, we're really grinding out a lot of transport vessels, a lot of combat vessels. So they're attacking us on the seas. Maybe we should defend ourselves on the seas. Send the U.S. combat fleet into British waters to seek out submarines and to protect U.S. vessels. We could have done that, but would that be enough to send the message to the world that in reality we ain't going to take it anymore? Declaration of war from Wilson, we're all in. We are going to go in and we are going to make sure that our enemies will fear us, at least then and in the future. Before I get off of this entirely, let me tell you what happened with unrestricted submarine warfare. When the German submarines, the U-boats, are attacking virtually every ship in British waters, or waters actually approaching Britain, they do start sinking more vessels. The kill ratio goes up quite noticeably. About, I guess this is true, but I read this in a book on naval warfare, where about 10%, at this time, about 10% of the vessels that actually went into British waters were sunk. The other 90% got through. Is this enough to slow down the supplying of Britain with food and munitions from the United States and Canada? This slows it down, but there's really at no point at which Britain is threatened with losing this war. Another issue is, of course, to meet the submarine threat, the industrial capacity of Britain had already ratcheted up considerably in shipbuilding. Germany actually isn't sinking ships throughout most of the war faster than they can be constructed. There's something else which I didn't have on this transparency, which I really should have stuck in here, and that is the convoy system. You see, even the British Naval High Command think convoys are a bad idea. You know what a convoy is? A convoy is you get all your merchant vessels here, all your trading vessels here, in a group, and you escort them across the oceans with combat vessels, with cruisers, with destroyers, who are there to protect the transport vessels from submarine attack. Now, there are times in the war, even in 1918, late in the war, where German submarines actually attack and take out British battle wagons. But it is very, very dangerous for these submarines to engage in combat vessels, to engage them, because, well, they'll come after you, and there's a pretty good chance they're going to get you. So why do the British not want to go with the convoys? Convoy actually in naval warfare is very, very old. If you go back, for example, to the 16th century, this is the 1500s, when Spain is bringing large amounts of silver and gold, many other things, from the Americas back to Spain. The difficulty is there are pirates, English pirates, that set upon them. Well, how are you going to protect all these vessels going out to Spain? The way you do so is you put them in convoys. The merchant vessels are protected, while the heavily armed battle wagons of the Spanish are there to protect them. So this idea is very old. Why don't the British like this? One of the reasons is simply this. They think it's a bad idea because it slows everything down. In other words, your convoy is going to have to go at the speed of the slowest vessel in the convoy. The more rapid vessels, should I say, bad choice of words, the vessels that are faster have to wait for the slower vessels. It's also more cumbersome because you get a convoy together in the United States, Canada, for example. You have to get everybody together at one time. So vessels that are ready to go and already properly outfitted, got their goods on board and have all their coal to get across the Atlantic, they're already waiting there for somebody else. And then when you get across, get to Bristol, Liverpool, and other ports in Britain, you get over there, and now everybody arrives at the same time. So it's very slow in, shall we say, getting the goods and services off the vessels. So it's a bad idea. However, it's a good idea. It's a very good idea. Yeah, these issues which I'm discussing, they're all very important. On the other hand, protecting the convoy is extremely important. Well, I believe it's by June 1917, early in the summer, when the convoy system became regular as far as going across to Britain is concerned, then the kill ratios from the German submarines goes down dramatically. I mean, usually by the summer, the kill ratio for a few months was like something close to 10%. Of the vessels coming in, now it's dropped to 1%. So bringing the United States in proves to be an absolute disaster for the Germans. And the idea of unrestricted submarine warfare does them no good at all. Well, let's go back to the United States briefly. Few men join. Of course, there's the call. America's being threatened. I mean, of course, the newspapers have been screaming, but a lot of people are simply saying, it's not my war. A lot of Americans, even though they're concerned about unrestricted submarine warfare and the Lusitania, they're saying, it's not my war. Not my war. How can I say the United States is being threatened by what's happening over 3,000 miles away? See, that's a challenge. So you get a call for volunteers, and the numbers come through very low. American men don't want to do this. Well, now we have a draft. The United States has already seen a draft during the Civil War. In 1863, the draft has a very bad reputation. We talk about the draft riots in New York in 1863, probably the largest single example of riots in American history, where Americans are upset and they're burning buildings and unfortunately attacking African Americans, even though African Americans have nothing to do with this. See, Americans don't want to be drafted. They don't like that. Well, but how else are you going to get men in? There's a lottery. They have the big bowl, and depending on your date when you're born, they pull out numbers and saying the people born on this time frame, under this number, shall we say, are going to be drafted first. So the real backbone of the U.S. Army are men who do not want to be there. They are men who are there simply because they are forced to be there. Take a little bit of a look at this. 13th Amendment. As you know, the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, right after the Civil War was over, is actually stating that the slaves are free. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln issued, is really a war powers measure. And is it really a statement that cannot be challenged in court? Of course, it could be challenged. But a constitutional amendment to free the slaves, that's actually what does it. So the 13th Amendment says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. Of course, the draft law is going to be challenged in court because, well, depending on your definition of slavery, is this really slavery? Well, not really. On the other hand, it does fit the definition as we see in the 13th Amendment, no involuntary servitude. Of course, this is argued in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, this is involuntary servitude. You can coerce men into doing their civic duty for their country. So it pretty well ends that. But a lot of people are pretty upset about that. Why do I mention that? Because the draft is going to terrorize a generation of young men in the 1960s and 1970s. Because if you're drafted, you go to Vietnam. Actually, the U.S. draft law ended in 1973, and we've not had a draft since then. 14 points. Well, Woodrow Wilson, remember, this guy starts out as a university professor at Princeton University in New Jersey. He uses that as a springboard. He's a professor. He's the president of Princeton University. He used that as a springboard to become the governor of New Jersey, and that as a springboard to become president of the United States. But this guy is one of our great eggheads in American history, American presidential history. He even wrote a biography of George Washington. It's interesting because when you read a biography of somebody, you're learning something about the author and, of course, about the object of the biography. It's fascinating if you read Wilson's biography of George Washington. You're actually get insights both into two presidents of the United States, Woodrow Wilson and George Washington. I mean, my goodness, this guy wrote multiple volumes on U.S. constitutional history. I mean, he understands the U.S. system very well. But that doesn't mean that he understands the political realities outside the United States and worldwide. Lenin calls for a universal revolution in late 1917. By darn, everybody rise up against your people. Take back the government that's held by the upper class people. Have a government for the lower class people. Communism. Well, essentially in reaction to this, in January 1918, Wilson comes out with his 14 points. And can we say naive idealism? What does he want? Self-determination. In other words, if you are a nation and you are a people and you identify yourself with people, you should have your national expression. What do you think Britain and France think about this? Holding a huge section of the world in chains. See, that flies in their face. When the biggest problem Britain has faced for centuries is Ireland. Britain does not want to free Ireland. Of course, Ireland wants to be freed. So, can we say, when the British and French get all these things, they go, what are you talking about? He wants peace without victory. Can we actually rationally sit down and figure things out? Why is that naive? Because bitterness has gone on for years. One thing we need to remember when we're talking about the peace negotiations, particularly in 1919, the Peace of Paris and the Treaty of Versailles, is that the belligerent nations, Britain, France, for example, you can throw in the Italians as well, have been preaching to their people to keep the war effort up, that we're going to take these people down. Our enemies are terrible. They're going to pay for what they've done. If they don't at least act like they're going through with that, you see that can be politically disastrous. The idea that everybody can sit down and talk this out is very kind of unrealistic. Remember, self-determination is also unrealistic because our allies won't go along with it. Freedom of the seas, yeah, free trade. Of course, that's a direct attack, is it not, on the British blockade of Germany, and also the German attempt to strangle Britain by the use of submarines. See, as Wilson comes out with this during the war, is that a veiled criticism of how the war is actually being fought. In many respects, Wilson has high ideals, but as a matter of practicality, this leaves a lot to be desired. Well, John Joseph Pershing, since he's the man with the most military experience, since he led the U.S. excursion into Mexico in 1916 and 1917, he's chosen to lead the American Expeditionary Force, the U.S. force sent to France during the First World War. Challenging man in many respects. He got moved up dramatically during his career because of political connections. Really because of his ability? Perhaps not. He's a bachelor for a long time. I think he had gonorrhea and venereal disease twice. He does get married later on. There's a fire in the fortress in San Francisco. It's called the Presidio. There was a fire, and his wife and I believe it was 3 daughters were killed. He has one son that does survive. But this guy has some very severe problems just leading into the time he's going to lead U.S. forces. Can we say the demons inside of him make him a little more callous than he might have been otherwise? Possibly. Remember going back, we talked about this earlier, where I call this kind of a silly mentality, I think, in retrospect, about the idea of attack. Remember, the Germans have this, the French are famous for this, and the Americans, Pershing's telling his men that in any circumstance, whatever's going on, you can't do anything, you can't figure out anything else to attack. You're outnumbered, attack. You're surrounded, attack. Your flanks are giving away, attack. And that's going to lead to very high casualties. So Americans are actually going to, who follow this, American commanders who follow this, are going to end up with large casualties. And I would say many of these are unnecessary. So he leads the American Expeditionary Force. I've already mentioned the United States. Get Pershing up here. Oh, it must be a Pershing someplace. Get the first name up here, John J. I believe it's John Joseph Pershing. Oh, he's ramrod straight. I'm a slouch. I have a hard time sitting up straight all the time. This guy never slouched. It's like he has a broomstick down his back all the time. He's working late at night going over many papers. He's leaning over a desk. Even then he wouldn't slouch. Every inch a soldier. Formidable looking gentleman. I'm not going to say totally competent in all respects. He's chosen by Wilson to lead the U.S. forces in France. He goes over early on. He's got to negotiate with the French. He's got to find bases for the French. All this is very, very challenging. Takes a lengthy period of time, and he needs to be on site in France to do this. Of course, he has to talk with the French commanders, French and British politicians as well. But it takes a long time to train, outfit, and transport an army. Now, with the draft laws, you have hundreds of thousands of men coming in the U.S. military. Eventually, over 4 million men are going to be in the U.S. military by the end of the war in 1918. And you start out with an army of about 100,000 men, and then you start pushing everybody in, and you got to find barracks. We don't have barracks, you got to have tents. So the guys are living in tents. Tents are easier to manufacture. All the problems setting up a camp, from food to sanitation, it's hard. You got to go to the manufacturers and say, we need uniforms. You see, as advantageous it is to France and Britain to have the United States come in as an ally to help them win the war, initially the productivity of the United States, which had been helping both France and Britain, is now shifted toward maintaining the Americans. So in the first months of the United States coming in, before our industry gets ratcheted up even higher, this actually is to the detriment of France and Britain. Long time to train. Men are out marching around, they don't have uniforms. They're wearing street clothes. They don't have rifles. It takes a while to manufacture all of this. They're drilling with sticks. Hold your stick, shoulder arms, stick, stick, stick. We're going to see this again also in the Second World War, when the United States expands its military, fashion has equipment for them. So if you have rifle fire and using a stick, where do you go? Bang, bang, bang. You're not really shooting them. Okay, gentlemen, hold your rifle like this. This is how you sight your rifle. Okay, there's a problem here, isn't there? It's going to take a long time to get equipment, training. On the Western Front, the United States has 4,000 artillery pieces, not one of which was manufactured in the United States. It's not like we don't have an industry that can produce these kind of things, but we are so far behind as far as technology is concerned. It's much better to buy the French, and most of these are French 75s, which the French are willing to sell to the United States. And I've already mentioned, we were talking about the air war. With the enormous productive capability of the United States, we deploy almost none combat aircraft on the Western Front for the simple reason, not that we can't manufacture these, but our aircraft designs are way behind. So our Americans are flying aircraft, which we bought from Britain, largely Sopwith Camels. Where do you get men of military background and training? Okay, West Point's been grinding out these guys for a while, but they're never large in number. It's not the large numbers that are being produced right now. Some universities, colleges have ROTC programs where you give some guys with some military training. But in reality, to have enough officers, we never do. I want to caution you on something. Sometimes we look at units like divisions, and all units and all divisions are not equal. You see, the U.S. units, divisions, tend to be something like 25,000 men. In Britain and France, if you have your total numbers, like closer to 12,000. Why on earth the Americans have such large divisions? Because if you have two divisions of 12,000 men, you need two generals to command them. If you have one division of 25,000 men, you have one general. See, the United States has difficulty getting enough. You can train a lot of men, but officers are harder to come by because they have a different kind of personality nonetheless, obviously, and they have to have more extensive training. I mean, we are taking men literally out of various occupations that have no military background at all and turning them into officers, we think, in a matter of months. Are all these men good? Some are pretty good, actually. There's a man named Charles Whittlesey who led the Lost Battalion in October 1918. When the war broke out, he was a lawyer. An intelligent guy. But he joins the military with training. He's a major within a year, fighting in desperate combat on the Western Front. He does very well. But you can see the kind of problems the United States has in building up its military. It takes a long time to train, outfit, and transport the Army. You can get the Army in the United States. You can get the camp set up. You can finally do away with sticks and give them uniforms as well. Give them rifles rather than sticks. But you still got to get them across the Atlantic. And already you have all these vessels going across to support Britain and France. Now you got to find more vessels to put American troops on them. And then you have also got to supply them when they're there. And America doesn't really have that level of transport. So though we're building transport vessels very, very rapidly, there's no time when the United States can actually transport and supply its own army by its own resources. So we have to turn to Britain. Okay. Britain has been hurt. The large loss of life by 1917. And Britain wants replacements. This is wonderful, isn't it? Americans even speak English. Couldn't you take Americans and shove them into British units? They can understand orders. They can follow what's being done. And there's the level of expertise that the British have gained with the military tradition and years of fighting on the Western Front that the Americans don't have. Simply shove them in as replacements. Of course, Pershing and the U.S. government says, no, 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 no. We really want to have men that are fighting under the U.S. flag. As silly as it seems, at one time Britain tried this ploy. I'll tell you what, if you do not allow Americans to come in as replacements into our units, we'll refuse to transport your troops. That's a silly ploy because who does that hurt? It hurts the British. It hurts their French ally. U.S. demands an independent command. There are several efforts, heavy efforts during the war to try to get the Americans to deploy their forces either as replacements or as small units, battalion size, regimental size, under the command of the French and British, to be led, shall we say, by the French and British, to shore up what the French and British are doing. And Pershing has to resist this, or chooses to resist this, on numerous occasions during the war. At one point, and I'll come back to the German spring offensives in 1918 in a later lecture, which really is the last gasp of the war, if you will. So I'll tell you how the war ends later on. But at one time, the Germans appear to be close to victory. It's like May 1st, 1918. While the U.S. has brought in hundreds of thousands of men by this time frame. Even though you try to train them in the United States, you transport them over to France, now you want them trained as well. And our allies, the French and the British, don't think that America is really in a position to take over a section of the trench and control it by themselves. So what they want is American units, battalions, brigades, shoved in when they need them at critical points. Of course, under French and British command. And Pershing, they rail on this guy. So you would rather see France destroyed than to send your men in. We badly need you. Pershing says, well, he didn't use the term drop dead, but it's what it means. No, we're going to have our independent command. So this becomes a big issue as we're deploying U.S. forces. It would be tempting to say, as we look at the German offensives in 1918, that the United States came in at a critical juncture. And we pushed a couple of divisions, we pushed them up to the front. Yeah, Pershing does relent to this point. He does allow some units to go in, but he's not going to allow that to be common practice. There are some units, African American units, that, remember, the United States military is not integrated. White units are white units, black units are black units. He does allow some black units to actually be put under French control. A little caveat here. In the regular army, the standing army in 1917, there are black units, and they're very good. The commanders, who are all white, realize this. And one thing they do not want to have happen is to send these very good black units to the Western Front and show how well African Americans can fight. So these units are not deployed to France. They're left back in the United States to patrol the border with Mexico. Now, the African American units do a pretty good job, the ones that are deployed, but the real good units are not allowed to be deployed. There are black Americans that are deployed in France. This is going to be an issue, a big issue later on, because initially the French don't know the rules. You don't know you treat these men very badly. And it's quite an eye-opener for African Americans to go over to France and find out that they can be treated decently. It becomes very difficult when you go back to the United States to be treated like dirt again. This is also going to be true in 1944 and 45, when African Americans, we call it the Red Ball Express, that are used as bringing up support materials to the white guys fighting at the front. But once again, they're treated better by the French, and it's going back to the United States. It's very, very difficult for them. Some civil rights doesn't really start with the Montgomery boycott in the 1950s, Montgomery bus boycott. There's also other issues involved in race relations, I should say ethnic relations in the United States, even before then. So the United States doesn't stop this. Can we say at the height of the German attacks and to go well into June 1918, there are about 170 divisions on the Western Front. Of these, 2 are the United States. Did we stop them? No. Did we participate? Yes, at a minor level. So by the end of the war, there's 43 divisions in France. However, only 29 were actually placed in combat roles. The United States really does not get heavily involved in combat until September of 1918. Pershing got what he wanted. We are deployed. The Americans are fighting under an American flag. We have an independent army. Meuse Argonne. In a period of a few months, the United States is involved in pounding into the Germans. In the Meuse Argonne offensive, the United States loses 27,000 men dead and over 100,000 wounded. In an earlier context, remember I was talking about the loss of the men at the Battle of the Somme on one day versus the highest casualties the United States ever faced in one battle during the Second World War, and that's the Battle of the Bulge. It took about 6 weeks to get fatalities that were actually not as high as the British suffered in a matter of hours on July 1st, 1916. But that's not the most costly battle that's ever been fought. The Meuse Argonne offensive, pounding for weeks, actually is the costliest battle. I guess you can call it a campaign if you want to. But I find it difficult to call it campaign, because when you're pound, 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 you're not breaking off with the enemy. I have to consider that to be the same battle. So this is, if you want to accept that definition, this is the most costly battle the United States had ever fought. We gain about 200 square miles. What's that? 20 by 20? I don't know. Was it worth the price? Maybe it was. Did the United States do well in the war? Well, there are times when the French High Command, looking at what the Americans are doing this time, saying, we wish we were more successful. There are times, however, when the Americans are badly outnumbered and being attacked in several directions, who hold themselves very well. One of the more famous battles is the Lost Battalion. I already mentioned Charles Wildersley. Can I get him up here? I can get at it this way. The Lost Battalion. Here's Charles Whittlesey. Remember, I think he graduated from Harvard. He's a lawyer. And he joins early on. Of course, he's got a few eyesight problems here. He's trapped behind German lines. They're badly outnumbered. Of course, the Germans by October 1918 had lost all their good troops. And it's really quite dramatic that we say we fight off numerous attacks. That does happen. But can we say the really good forces are really not there anymore? Any event, the United States cut off. They're in a ravine behind German lines. There's like 500 men. They're being shelled by the Germans. The Germans attack. The Germans offer to take the Americans prisoner. Will you surrender? Your men are dying. You're suffering. And the famous quote he writes back and tells them to go to hell. His words, not mine. Well, talk about macho. When it's true, they are relieved. They're not overwhelmed. Oh, got to tell you one more story. A lot of times communication during the war from the trenches were actually wires. They take the wires back underneath the ground deep enough so shell fire will not bust them up. But Whittlesey's cut off. He does not have communication. So what he has is carrier pigeons. And a lot of units do this kind of thing. I already mentioned at Fort Vaux in 1916 at the Battle of Verdun, that the French held out, and even after they sent their last pigeon, were gone, right? Well, something similar is happening here. In the Lost Battalion, the Americans are cut off. They have one passenger pigeon yet, one carrier pigeon, I should say that. And that's all they've got, and they're being shelled by their own artillery. You see, the artillery doesn't know exactly where they're at. The artillery thinks they're shelling the Germans, but they're shelling their own men. Well, you've got to stop this. So they took a pigeon. Why do I care? Because I used to raise pigeons. I quite like birds. Cherami. Cherami, I believe he's stuffed in the Smithsonian right now. Maybe it's a she. Okay. Cherami, to put a little message on her, she took off. Of course, when the Germans ever see pigeons flying out, they have really good reason to believe they're carrying messages. So open fire on this bird. I don't know how she got back. She crawled back. As you can see, she's missing one of her legs right here. It was actually just dangling on. It wasn't really in control. Of course, they had to take it off. She got the message back. The shelling ceased. She saved lives. And she is one of the most... I like pigeons. I'm sorry. I like pigeons. Just absolutely adore the birds. Any event, she has, of course, been great honor. I think the French gave her the Croix de Guerre, and one of the better received, shall we say, animals, literally in American history. The Lost Battalion does show the Americans really did have a great ability to fight. They were in the 82nd Division. During World War II, this is going to be the 82nd Airborne Division. And in World War I, there was one Medal of Honor given to the 82nd Division. In World War II, the 82nd Airborne Division, there was also one Medal of Honor given. Whittlesey got the Medal of Honor. Let's get back to him. I believe we've got a picture of an honor being given to him. Of course, he's a big celebrity when he comes home. And for years, people want him to talk. They make a big fuss over this guy, the Medal of Honor winner. And he finally killed himself. There's not just people praising him. There are people contacting him all the time. What happened to my son that died in your unit? So he killed himself. Well, the United States contribution is not minor, but it comes late. After the German attacks had already been defeated, the United States comes in a very real sense. And the United States are attacking positions that the Germans, the Meuse-Argonne offensive, are already either preparing to abandon or they've already pulling back. Is this something that shows the fighting ability of the United States? I think it does, but it's not quite the same in duration, intensity, and against a well-prepared enemy that the French and British are going to have to face, have already faced for years. Let's see where we're at for time. We're running out. So let me just say that I'm pleased that you're still with me. We're getting late in the course. We're going to have to say a lot to wrap things up. But there's one thing I want to make a big deal about next time, and that's women in society. What happens to women? I'm going to repeat myself, but can we say that the wars have a tendency to change society more rapidly and more profoundly than any other human endeavor? And that's going to change, to a large extent, the role and function of women in society, which we'll address next time. In the meantime, have the best day possible. And this is lecture 25 of the World War I class.